Okay, so in this video, what we're going to talk about is what I call the mechanics of persuasion. We're going to talk about using rhetorical appeals to engage your audience. So some of this is going to be review, and some of this is going to be maybe a new way of thinking about this. So I want to bring back into your mind the rhetorical triangle. So this may look a little different than we've looked at it before, but this is still the basic rhetorical triangle. You've got the audience, the author, or here I've used the word speaker, it's a more general term, and the subject or the topic or the content. What are you talking about? So who's doing the listening, who's doing the talking, and what's being talked about. Now, the three rhetorical appeals in classical rhetoric are ethos, pathos, and logos, and you probably encountered them before, maybe in English 103, maybe in a previous English class. What's new in this slide is that I've applied them to the rhetorical situation. Because if you'll recall, ethos is authority, pathos is emotion, and logos is logic. But what they do is they put the focus on different aspects of the rhetorical situation. So if we look at this, ethos looks at who is doing the speaking and what is their authority to speak on that subject. Logos looks at what is the nature of the subject and why does that make sense. Pathos focuses on how should the audience feel about that. So let's go into some more detail. Ethos is the emphasis on the author. When you see ethos, think authority, not ethics. It's the same root word, but the words have changed meaning. Just how awful and awesome used to actually mean exactly the same thing, which is full of awe or producing awe. But obviously, if someone says that's awful, it doesn't mean the same thing as that's awesome. So words change. Just go with that. So when you see ethos, think authority. When you see ethical, think moral. Not completely accurate, but it'll do. So what ethos does is it focuses on who is the speaker and why do they have the authority to say that. You can actually borrow ethos from people. By saying, for instance, when you make an argument that people should be vaccinated and you say, well, the Center for Disease Control says, that's borrowing authority from the Center for Disease Control. That's saying these people know what they're talking about, therefore, by quoting them, so do I. These are some examples of common, everyday examples of ethos appeals. You've known me for a long time. I always keep my word. I've done a lot of research. I am the researcher, therefore you should believe me. Allow me to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Jones has published widely about, so we're giving ethos, we're taking ethos. Or let's imagine for each of these, you're trying to persuade your boss to give you a raise. So in this one, we say, you should give me a raise because I'm your best worker. And then I would provide some evidence for, this is why I have that authority. I've been here for 10 years. I've only had 2 sick days, whatever it is. Pathos focuses on the audience. It focuses on the emotional response of the audience. The absolute classic version of this is the In the Arms of an Angel advertisements for animal adoption. And the idea of it is to make you feel sad so that you want to help the animals. There's plenty of other cases. If you ever hear someone say, if you really loved me, you would do such and such, just run, because that's actually a very manipulative kind of structure. But it is an example of a pathos appeal where you're trying to evoke a certain emotion in your audience. Other less manipulative pathos appeals, you deserve to feel great, therefore you should do this thing that will make you feel great. It's very common in advertising to do that. So it's not always sad, although the term pathos, when we use it as a critical term for art, does refer to sadness. But pathos as a rhetorical appeal simply refers to an emotional response in your audience. So for instance, you might say to your boss, you should give me a raise because I'm a single mother struggling to make ends meet. I had to feed my children ramen all last week. I need a raise. whatever it is, something that makes your boss feel an emotional response that would then elicit the action that you're trying to get out of them, which is to get the raise. Finally, there's logos. And this is emphasis on the content. This is formal logic. This is where you use if, then, therefore statements. This is where you just overwhelm them with evidence, and you use objective sounding language, cause-effect relationships, and so on. You'll see this very commonly in debates and so on. So let's say you're trying to get that boss. You say, you should give me a raise because my last quarter sales increased by 25% as a result of my team's efforts. And, I have this chart for you. Be careful with logos. Logos seems to be the most persuasive because we have a culture that says that it should be, even though that's not the case most of the time. Notice I've put an asterisk here on this statistic. That's because statistics, which are a subset of logos appeals, are dangerous. So as the saying goes, there's lies, damned lies, and statistics, and we can talk about the rhetorical advice in that quote for days, but suffice to say, we get the joke. So never trust statistics. They're really useful tools. They give us precise quantitative data. We need statistics to fully understand large picture stuff. But they create the illusion of objectivity and scientific authority, sometimes when there isn't any. And even where the most rigorous standards have been applied to the statistics, there's always bias in the questions that are being asked. So there have been a lot of recent studies on algorithms, for instance, that have noted that because humans have biases, so also do the softwares and algorithms that they write. For instance, it's pretty well known now that face detection software and motion sensor software in like soap dispensers in public places has some racial bias because they forgot to train it on Black people as well as on white people. And that wasn't intentional, but people have these inherent biases. They have biases about what they want to ask, and therefore the information may not be complete. So pay attention to the frames when you look at statistics, and pay attention to the content and the method, especially. So I'm going back to that research project I'm doing on National Novel Writing Month. And here's the data that got me wanting to do that project. In 2011, over 36,000 people wrote a novel during November. Well, that sounds impressive, doesn't it? Now, this sounds less impressive. In 2011, nearly 15% of participants in National Novel Writing Month succeeded in writing 50,000 words. In 2011, fewer than 2 out of every 10 participants wrote over 50,000 words. It's getting more and more pessimistic sounding here. It's the same data. In 2011, there were over 5 times as many participants in National Novel Writing Month than there were in 2001, 10 years before. Well, that sounds optimistic. So, with exactly the same data, I can change, especially in these first 3 examples. Same number of people. Same exact stuff. So you think, okay, fine. I'll just put it in a chart and let my reader decide. The same data, but it's a different chart with different focus. And I would like to point out that these charts are not especially unethical. I haven't done anything weird with charts in any weird positions, as sometimes happens. It's just that I have phrased the data in a different way. And there isn't a way that I can phrase it the same there isn't a way that I can convey all these things at the same time. I always have to choose one. So the way that I phrase statistics is always a little biased. So consider very carefully. How can you manipulate your rhetoric to achieve your purpose? So what appeals are going to work best to get what you want? And what is your purpose? How can you avoid logical fallacies? So we haven't talked a lot about logical fallacies. You can certainly look them up. We could spend all day listing them. If you look at the Wikipedia entry on it, it's huge. Um, Basically, a logical fallacy is anywhere where one thing doesn't really mean the other, but it seems like it should. Logical fallacies are not necessarily bad. They don't mean your argument is not working, but you have to be careful with them. Um, so, which brings me to the question: how can you use it to your advantage? And should you be using a logical fallacy in your situation? Are you in a situation where ethically that would actually hurt your appeal? That's a problem. Um, what are your audience's expectations? Do they expect to be emotionally uh, persuaded, or do they expect you to focus just on the topic? Um, and do some genres require more of one than the other? So we've talked about how academic writing uses a lot more logos. Well, in the web-based writing, you might not, but it depends. And are certain appeals actually forbidden in some genres? Is it just taboo to do that? So you have to use your critical thinking about your rhetorical situation to choose what kinds of appeals you want to use.